Good morning, Brian. So here we are at Falconbridge, and you're my current victim. So maybe you might like to tell me a bit about how we originally met and where you grew up.
Okay. Well, we both grew up in a soldier settlement area of Loxton, which was set up after the Second World War. My father had grown up in a soldier settlement area in Monash, which is another town on the Upper Murray, because his father was a returned man from the First World War, and he'd been granted a 15-acre block and raised 5 children on it. My father eventually bought him out after the war, but the property was too small, so he applied for and was granted 32 acres at Loxton and joined several hundred ex-servicemen and growing various types of fruit. And Jeff, well, his father, similar circumstances, but his grant covered setting up a dairy. So Jeff and I went to the same primary school, starting together, same year, 1956.
Okay, just hold on. So Brian, what was life like for you on the fruit block at Loxton North?
Well, I learned to drive very early. Buckboards, tractors. In fact, Dad would get me from age about 10 or 11. He'd drop me in town when where the tractor had been serviced, and I'd have to drive it home. So independent quite early in that regard. The fruit blocks were fairly large. They were planted with all sorts of wine grapes, oranges, sultanas, peaches, you name it. And the more diversified the block, the better the profit normally. It was a pleasant existence, but one that I found constraining, because I always looked beyond the country town and its narrowness as I felt it. I remember at night time I would look, I could see in the distance the glow of other towns, Renmark, Berry, Barmera. But that was not enough for me. Eventually, my means of escape was to go to university, and since then I've lived in the city. And so a good place to grow up, yes, but drawbacks if you were outward looking.
Yes, I remember looking at those glows of those towns.
Yeah.
When you'd drive around through the back of Renmark and whatnot, you'd see the glow of the towns like Berry and Loxton and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yes. So you mentioned that you had a Graham Page buckboard, is that right?
That's right, yes. Well, very little of it, well, it was just the engine and front bit. They'd knock the rear of the vehicle off, and the buckboard was truly that. It was a flat wooden thing. There was no actual car seat. You sat on the timber, and it had to be filled regularly with water every journey down the block. You come back, you'd have to fill it with water again, which was a bit restrictive, but it was only used on the property.
That was a very rare car. Do you know whatever happened to it?
No, I can't remember. I remember when my dad upgraded to a Datsun Ute. I think he parted with it then, but he wouldn't have quite possibly have known its value then, or
Well, it wasn't worth anything.
Probably not.
Probably went to the Loxton North tip or something.
Yeah, could have well done. Yeah.
That's right. So you went to the Loxton North Primary School and you went there for 7 years, I guess.
I did. Yes. And
do you remember any of your teachers there?
I remember our first teacher, a small red-headed woman.
Miss Clifton.
Miss Clifton was her name, yes. And I remember working my way up the scale to eventually year 7 was next to the principal's office and the staff room. I remember being caned for arriving at school early, and boys had beaten me to it, but they'd broken in through the staff room window to get a cricket bat and balls. By the time I arrived, they were already playing, but as was the way of it, you know, it was a shared punishment, and I got the cane along with everyone else, even though I'd taken no part of the crime and in fact didn't even know of it.
Who was your favourite teacher at primary school?
That's a very good question. I think it was a guy I had in year 6, such as a favourite. I can't remember his name, but I soaked in whatever I could learn there. I read the whole library. My mother was an avid reader. Between us, I think we read out the Loxton Library. And beyond that, when there was a railway service between the city and Loxton, I used to get a monthly set of books chosen by Mr. Bridson, the chief librarian of the main library in Adelaide. Science fiction mostly I chose, and so I would read those books and then send them back on the rail service.
Yeah.
So
I think we all did that.
we all did that. It was, I guess, it helped a lot in my general knowledge, and basically awakened me that there was another world out there, and one that I wished to explore.
Do you remember going to the school library and seeing a film on the old Bell and Howell projector?
The old Helen Barrel projector, yes. Well, when I got into education, we kept using those. I remember, probably the film I remember most watching was a guy who ran, his name was Tom Cruise, but different spelling to the film star. And Tom ran these old trucks up the Simpson Desert, backwards and forwards, delivering the mail and other essential supplies. That one sticks vividly in my mind, and I was pleased to see one of the trucks in the Birdwood Mill Museum preserved there, which was...
Yes, it's the very truck.
The very truck, although there were many of those trucks. But he wore out over the years. But yeah, the films, which also came on the railway, I think, in a leather box with a strap around it, they were one of the highlights of the school week or fortnight. Yeah,
that was a real treat.
It was, yeah, because we didn't have TV.
No.
I remember the year we first got television. It was. I was 11 years old, I think, and the reception was patchy, even though we had a 60-foot antenna, and but that again was an eye-opener, even though the palette was much more restricted than today.
Right, just hold it. So after Loxton North Primary, we all went to Loxton High School. Do you recall a lot about the high school, and what were the most significant things that happened to you there?
All right. Well, I rode my bike, as I did to primary school. high school, I met a whole lot of new folk from the actual town, the large township of Loxton. One of the first things I remember was doing the IQ test, and because of my general knowledge, that put me in 1A, which was the Latin class. So I did several years of Latin.
With Mr. Bird.
Yeah, with Mr. Bird, yes. And I found Latin useful in crosswords and trips to South America and Italy. I can still interpret newspapers, written stuff, based on the Latin that I recall learning. My experiences at high school were mixed. I copped a bit of bullying. I had, because of that, my share of fights. I always stuck up for for kids who were on the outer, and that brought attention upon me from the school bullies. One I remember, I'd had enough of him. I called him out. I said, okay, this is it, end of the school day. But he never fronted up. Such is the nature of bullies. Often when they're called out, suddenly they're not so brave.
Indeed.
Mm.
You might remember we had a few characters at the school, and in those days we never met any Asians, but we had one girl there that was, I think, a Malaysian Chinese. I think she was the first Asian girl I ever met. Do you recall her?
I don't recall her, but it's interesting you raise that. One of my reasons for wanting to leave the area was that I considered it very xenophobic. Mm. We would, in the summer, get casual labour would come, people would come up from the city, university students, people of other cultures, and we looked upon them with great suspicion, mostly out of ignorance. But I found that narrowness of perspective difficult to deal with.
Yes, I can remember giving some Greek kids a hard time that were part of those itinerant labour force. They'd send the kids to primary school for a term.
That's right. Mm. Yeah, those kids had a hard road because they were moved in and out from the city for a few months of fruit picking. Yeah, they had a difficult time. We had some living in our Nissen hut at times. The Nissen huts were the original habitation we had, which was basically a galvanised iron shed.
Left over from World War II.
They were, and last time I visited our fruit block, I met the current owners, and they allowed me to wander about, and the Nissen hut's still there, held up, I'm sure, just by the rust.
Yes. So you graduated from high school and then hurtled off to university?
I did. I'd done, based on career advice, I'd done mostly science subjects, but and so I did get an enrolment at Adelaide Uni to do a science degree, but what I found was that wasn't really the direction that I should have taken, but I persisted. But along the way, I studied psychology. Actually, I did a couple of years of psychology as part of a science degree. Eventually, I graduated, and I got a job briefly as a geologist, but it coincided with one of the downturns, one of the many cyclic downturns of the mining industry, and there were several hundred unemployed geologists around Australia, and we became mostly either taxi drivers or teachers, and I chose the latter and remained in education for the rest of my working life. At times I was tempted to go back and have a try at geology. Once I'd been principal for a while, I thought, well, okay, I've got the science background and I've got a human resources background. Why not go into a mining company in the personnel side? I looked at that, but the decision in the end was to stick with what I knew, which was what I should have realised rather than taking the initial career advice. My love was people, talking to people, and I found counselling easy. I was a secondary school counsellor for 16 years, and they were very enjoyable times for me.
So where did you commence your job first as a teacher?
The most appointments of teachers at that point, they were crying out for teachers to go to the country. Now, I was a country boy, so that I was a prime suspect, I suppose, and I remember people schooled us as to what you should say in your interview when you ended up with your first placement. And I remember being advised never say you like surfing because you'll end up at Ceduna, which was on the far west coast of South Australia. I ended up on York Peninsula at Midleton High School, and I spent only a year teaching there, because during that time I had I taught science and maths, and I had in one of my Year 8 science classes a boy who could read number but could not understand one letter. He couldn't write a thing, and he was quite bright. I mean, he would listen to my lessons. I would actually take him out in the corridor while the other kids were having a test. I'd give him the test orally. He always knew the answers. This fascinated me, and I decided I wanted to get into special education, and to do that, to start teaching that, I had to go back to the city, which I did, and taught 2 or 3 different special classes in very low socio-economic areas. And then I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to study the first year of a special education degree. After that, I got a job running a school in a psychiatric institution, which was fascinating. I did that for a couple of years, and then moved from that into high school counselling, and I was a counsellor in 3 different high schools, again all in low socio-economic areas. I learned a lot from those experiences. I remember one lad, he schooled me. I called in this lad because he'd beaten up rather severely another student, and very erudite lad. And I called him in for a chat, and he said, look, I know why you, these are my words, but what he said was, I know why you want to speak to me. I know what I did, but you need to understand my life. My grandfather beat the shit out of my father until he was old enough to beat him back. My father beat the shit out of me until last year, and I knocked him out. And he leaves me alone now. But this is how I grew up. This is the way that my life works for me. I understand your point of view, but you need to understand the environment I live in.
Quite remarkable, but I suppose not all that much now in view of what we've learnt about life with some people.
Exactly, and I found the students there, by and large, very honest about things that were happening in their lives. I found the parents sometimes tough to approach, but sometimes very angry. But as a principal, what I found was a lot of the parents had had poor experiences themselves at school and wouldn't think of making a formal appointment to see me as a principal. So I was always out in the schoolyard before school, and I would approach parents and engage them in conversation, and I got a lot more respect by doing that, and that worked. My visibility worked. I started one of my schools in the middle of the school year because the previous principal had moved on, and it was my first days, and as was my wont, I was wandering around the schoolyard. A parent went to the front office and said, "Look, there's this rough-looking bloke hanging around the schoolyard." I said, "Oh, don't worry, that's just our new principal."
Now, you spent a lot of time travelling around Asia. When did that start?
Well, interestingly, my father's overseas war experience was New Guinea. He was on the Kokoda Trail, and so the first place I travelled to was New Guinea. While I was at uni, the uni had a scheme whereby they organised students to go overseas and teach English for the entire length of the uni holidays, which was about 3 months. And myself and a couple of mates, we went to New Guinea. I went, one of my mates went to Bougainville, another Mount Hagen in the Highlands, and I went to a tribe in New Britain and lived with them. They built me a hut. I sat under a coconut tree teaching a few kids, teaching them English. I mean, the tribe were very clever in a way. That was their way of creating interpreters. That tribe was still having wars with the inland tribes in New Britain. Everywhere I went, there were young men with their spears and shields. One of the headmen of the village let it be known, if anyone touches this man, I'll kill him. And so that was a fascinating experience and a great first overseas trip, from which I always say, when you come back from an overseas trip, you suffer some sort of a bit of a malaise. But for me, I found it hard to come back because I'd adjusted to a village way of life. I found what they did was very democratic. I came back to mainland New Guinea, run by expatriates. I found them incredibly racist, and I did not like what I saw in colonial New Guinea.
How long were you there for?
3 months, yeah.
I see.
And then I remember flying back. I left the Highlands and flew to Port Moresby, and then I was booked on a flight from Port Moresby to Brisbane, from Brisbane to Sydney, and Sydney to Adelaide. I'd given away quite a lot of my clothing. I had shoulder-length hair, a Hawaiian shirt, and cut-off blue jeans. I arrived, and also a collection of bows and arrows and pig spears and various things that I'd been given by the tribe. I arrived in Brisbane, and the customs officer took particular dislike to me. And I carried this bow strung until we got to Brisbane. But the string had been made from bamboo, soaked in water, but by this time it was getting a bit dry. And as this customs officer was inspecting me minutely, every arrow, spear and my bow for woodworm, tried to get me on something, the string broke, and it went whap and got him straight between my legs. So I picked up my paraphernalia, said, "Thanks, mate." Got through customs, but too late for the flight between Brisbane and Sydney. The airline were very apologetic. I said, "Look, don't worry," and they got me on a first-class seat. They found me a first-class seat, sitting between two businessmen, on a flight from Brisbane to Sydney. So there I am in my cut-off jeans and Hawaiian shirt, and we arrive in Sydney. I get taken to the head of the taxi line in front of dozens and dozens of people. They booked me a taxi, and because it was too late, the last flight to Adelaide had already left, I was transported and I stayed in the Menzies in Sydney. At that time, that was the only 5-star hotel in Sydney. Now, I hadn't slept in a bed for months, and I hadn't had running water for months. In fact, I couldn't sleep because the bed was too comfortable. So, next day, not really refreshed, but finally, they booked me on a flight to Adelaide. So I eventually got home, but that was my first overseas adventure.
So what was your next one?
Oh, well, that happened at the end of the year that I was teaching at Middleton. I befriended Mari Parsons, who'd married Walford, one of the 5th generation farmers on York Peninsula. Mari was a wonderful artist, and she used to go in for these like Women's Weekly competitions and would illustrate them with her own artwork. And she'd won trips for 2 to Europe, and fridges and televisions and all sorts. And she won a trip for 1 to South America, all airfares included. She had no use for it. I bought the tickets off her for $400. So after my first year of teaching, I had 7 weeks travelling around South America. including a stopover on the way on Easter Island. I got out to the Amazon where I visited a head hunting tribe, and it was a real... I actually missed a flight in this town called Iquitos, which is right in the middle of the continent, not far from the Brazilian border. Iquitos was a strange town. I saw sailors wandering around. What are sailors doing here in uniform? So I went down to the docks, and there's a destroyer tied up at the docks. This is 1,000 kilometres upstream, up the Amazon. Such is the river that it could take a destroyer all that distance upstream. I missed a flight, was told, you know, this rainy season's approaching, you won't get another flight for possibly months. But I met this friend Charlie, this guy Charlie, and what do? We went to a fiesta, we went dancing, and we met a couple of girls who happened to work in an airline office. It was run mostly for the military. But they pushed a person off a flight list and put me on a few days later. So I escaped to Iquitos. Then from there, went by train across Bolivia, across the high plains. So I went to Machu Picchu, down to Brazil, across to Chile. Chile was the country I first arrived in, and I'd met some Chileans in Adelaide. There was a community there of basically refugees from, when I arrived, a military dictatorship was in place. Allende was the, it was a big CIA thing. The CIA had deposed the previous left-wing president, and I visited a family in Chile and stayed for a few days. Their Adelaide connection asked me to take along a small wading pool. You know, the things they had for kids. It was your blue plastic like a tarp, and it had an aluminium frame which you'd put together, and you could put water in it about that deep. So I rock up in the airport in Chile, and first thing I noticed, there were guys on the tarmac with their submachine guns, very tricky politically. There were bullet holes in the windows of the airport. I had a couple of interesting experiences. One was going through customs, explaining how this knockdown wading pool was not, in fact, some sort of rifle that you could put together. With my very limited Spanish, I got over that obstacle and I went to the loo. And I was handed a toilet roll by a soldier, and sitting in the loo, and after a while, bang, bang, bang on the door. So using my vast knowledge of Spanish, I said, "Hola momento, hola momento." Pulled up strides, opened the door, and there's this soldier with his gun trained on me. I've been there too long. And pretty much every country I visited at that stage was a military dictatorship. As the lone gringo, often on a bus, I'd be stopped. They'd empty out my rucksack, you know, against the wall, search for weapons. It was a bit tricky, but I met a lot of wonderful people.